The moment the water stopped flowing, everyone wanted someone to blame, but nobody thought to ask who had always owned the place where it began. My phone started ringing before the sun had fully cleared the pine trees. One call became 5, then 10, then so many that the screen barely stopped vibrating long enough to show another number. I silenced it, slipped the phone back into my jacket pocket, and looked across the valley instead. Nearly 800 feet below me, Willow Ridge Estates looked exactly as it always had. Perfect streets curved around rows of expensive homes. Freshly mowed lawns stretched across gentle hills. White fences reflected the first golden light of the morning. The only thing missing was movement. The fountain at the neighborhood entrance had gone silent. Lawn sprinklers never came alive. Residents stood in driveways holding coffee mugs, staring toward dry flower beds with confused expressions that slowly turned into concern. A black sport utility vehicle climbed the winding mountain access road much faster than anyone should have driven on loose gravel. Dust rolled behind it until the vehicle stopped only a few yards from where I stood. Margaret Holloway stepped out before the engine was even off. Her navy blazer looked strangely out of place against the rugged mountain landscape, but her expression matched the urgency of the morning perfectly. "Turn it back on," she demanded before saying hello. Her voice echoed across the granite ridge while the cool mountain air carried the scent of damp earth and pine sap between us. I never answered immediately. Instead, I unfolded an old topographic survey across the hood of my pickup truck. The paper had softened with age after decades of careful storage, and the faded contour lines still traced every rise, creek, and spring exactly as they had generations ago. Margaret stared at the map with growing impatience. "People do not have water," she said. "This is affecting the entire neighborhood." I looked from the survey to the valley below, where small groups of homeowners had gathered near the community pump station. Even from that distance, I could see utility trucks arriving while confused. Residents pointed toward equipment they had probably never noticed before. "I did not shut anything off," I said quietly. She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Then explain this." I folded the map carefully and returned it to its weatherproof tube. "That is exactly what I have been trying to do for months." Her expression shifted from frustration to disbelief. She had expected an argument. She had expected excuses. She had expected me to panic. Instead, I climbed onto the overlook beside the old stone spring house that had rested there longer than either of us had been alive. Cold, crystal-clear water still flowed steadily through the weathered collection channel before disappearing beneath layers of granite and forest floor. Nothing up there had changed. The mountain remained quiet except for birds greeting the morning and wind moving gently through towering pines. Whatever had interrupted service below had not started here. Margaret followed my gaze toward the flowing spring, then back toward the silent neighborhood beneath us. For the first time since I met her, she looked uncertain. She believed the answer was hidden somewhere inside that mountain, and in one way she was right. What she still did not understand was that the real story had begun years before either of us stood on that ridge, and every forgotten survey, every old boundary marker, and every faded county record had been quietly waiting for this exact morning. When I bought that mountain, people assumed I had made the worst financial decision of my life. They saw 160 acres of steep granite, dense pine forest, and narrow dirt trails that climbed into the clouds. They saw land that could not become another subdivision, another shopping center, or another luxury resort. I saw something completely different because my father had taught me to read a landscape long before I ever learned to read engineering blueprints. Every fall he would drive me into these mountains in an old pickup truck that smelled like cedar, worn leather, and black coffee. We would hike for hours carrying nothing except a compass, folded county maps, and enough sandwiches to last the afternoon. While other fathers pointed out deer or fishing spots, mine pointed at ridgelines, drainage channels, and natural springs. He always said that land tells the truth if you stop talking long enough to listen. At the time, I thought he was simply teaching me about the outdoors. Years later, I realized he had been teaching me about people as well. That lesson stayed with me through college and eventually into a career as a civil engineer. I spent nearly 15 years designing roads, stormwater systems, bridges, and municipal infrastructure across several states. Most people looked at finished neighborhoods and admired the houses. I automatically wondered where the drainage flowed, how the utilities were routed, in which natural features had existed long before the first shovel touched the ground. That habit never disappeared. One afternoon, while reviewing public land records for an unrelated transportation project, I noticed the mountain overlooking Willow Ridge Estates had quietly been listed for sale after an estate settlement. Nobody seemed interested. Developers wanted flatter land. Investors wanted commercial frontage. Even local real estate agents described the property as beautiful but impractical. I scheduled a visit anyway. The moment I stepped onto the ridge, the cool mountain breeze carried the familiar scent of pine needles and damp stone that instantly reminded me of hiking there with my father decades earlier. The old stone spring house still stood exactly where I remembered, weathered by time but remarkably intact. Crystal clear water continued flowing through the narrow collection channel with the same steady rhythm it had always followed. I knelt beside the spring, dipped my hand into the icy water, and smiled without saying a word. It was not because I had discovered something new. It was because I recognized something everyone else had overlooked. A month later, I signed the closing documents without telling anyone why I wanted the property so badly. Friends congratulated me politely before asking what I planned to build. I simply said I had no plans to build anything. That answer confused almost everyone. They believed valuable land always needed to become something bigger. I believed some places were already valuable exactly as they were. For the first several weeks after taking ownership, my weekends followed the same quiet routine. I repaired old fencing, replaced weathered boundary markers, cleared fallen branches from forgotten trails, and carried my field notebook everywhere I went. Standing on the highest ridge each Saturday morning, I watched the growing neighborhood below expand one house at a time. From that distance, everything looked peaceful, organized, and permanent. I had no idea that the people moving into those beautiful homes would soon become far more interested in my mountain than I ever expected. The first time I met Margaret Holloway, the neighborhood still smelled like fresh concrete and newly planted maple trees. Willow Ridge Estates had only been open a few months, and moving trucks still appeared almost every weekend. I was replacing an old boundary marker near my access road when a spotless white sport utility vehicle stopped beside the gravel entrance. Margaret stepped out wearing a tailored navy blazer, neatly pressed slacks, and the kind of confident smile that suggested she had never heard the word no. She introduced herself as president of the Homeowners Association before asking a single question about who I was. Then she looked past me toward the mountain and casually asked how long the construction crew planned to stay. I smiled and told her there was no construction crew because I owned the mountain. She laughed softly as though I had made a harmless joke. When I showed her the recorded deed from a weatherproof document tube, she barely glanced at the first page before handing it back. According to her, the association already had long-term plans to improve the hillside with scenic walking trails, observation areas, and nature paths that would benefit every homeowner. She spoke with complete certainty, never asking whether those plans involved land that actually belonged to someone else. I listened without interrupting because experience had taught me that people often reveal more than they intend when they believe they are completely in control. Before leaving, Margaret handed me a glossy welcome packet filled with community guidelines, architectural standards, landscaping recommendations, and neighborhood expectations. Near the back of the booklet, someone had highlighted a sentence encouraging neighboring property owners to cooperate for the benefit of the community. At first glance, it sounded perfectly reasonable. Over the following weeks, I learned that Margaret had a very specific definition of cooperation. Bright survey ribbons I tied along my property lines disappeared one by one. Weekend hikers wandered farther onto my land, carrying neighborhood trail maps printed with the association logo. Several residents cheerfully thanked me for allowing future public access, genuinely believing the mountain would soon become part of the community. When I politely explained that no easement existed and the property remained private, most looked surprised rather than offended. They had simply accepted what they had been told. A few days later, another certified letter arrived requesting permission to conduct environmental studies on my land for planned recreational improvements. Attached to the request was a colorful concept drawing showing walking trails crossing directly through sections of my property that had never been offered for public use. I spread the drawing across my kitchen table beside the county survey I had studied so many times before. The bright marketing illustration and the faded engineering map described the same mountain, but they told completely different stories. One imagined future attractions. The other documented permanent boundaries that had existed for generations. During the following month, the association became noticeably more persistent. More letters arrived. More questions appeared. More neighbors wandered uphill believing they had every right to be there. Each small incident by itself seemed harmless enough, but together they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Margaret believed she was slowly expanding the neighborhood. I quietly began to suspect she was leading everyone towards something she did not fully understand, and whatever it was, it lay somewhere far beyond the hiking trails she kept talking about. By early spring, the mountain no longer felt as quiet as it had when I first bought it. Every weekend, I found fresh boot prints crossing patches of soft soil where no public trail existed. Bright orange survey flags appeared in places where I knew I had never placed them. Small wooden stakes marked lines that ignored every recorded property boundary I had carefully restored. At first, I assumed a contractor had simply made an honest mistake. As an engineer, I had seen plenty of survey errors over the years. But mistakes usually disappeared after one conversation. These only multiplied. One Saturday morning, I followed a string of fluorescent ribbons tied from tree to tree until they reached the old stone spring house. Someone had spray-painted small arrows on nearby rocks and driven temporary stakes into the ground as if they were tracing a route instead of measuring one. None of the markings followed the easiest hiking path. They curved downhill through the same narrow valley where groundwater naturally collected before disappearing beneath layers of granite. I stood there for several minutes studying the pattern without touching anything. It reminded me less of a recreational trail and far more of preliminary infrastructure work. That afternoon, another envelope arrived from the Homeowners Association. This one announced that licensed contractors would soon begin evaluating portions of the surrounding landscape to improve future community amenities. The letter sounded friendly enough, but nowhere did it acknowledge that every location described in the proposal sat on privately owned land. I declined the request in writing and attached copies of the recorded boundary survey. A week later, 2 pickup trucks climbed my access road anyway. The workers were polite and immediately apologized when I introduced myself. They explained they had been hired to locate several existing utility corridors shown on planning documents provided by the association. I asked to see the drawings. One contractor unfolded a large color map across the tailgate of his truck. My eyes immediately locked onto a series of blue lines running beneath the proposed walking trail. They were not recreational features. They represented underground water infrastructure. The contractor pointed toward the valley below and casually mentioned that someone from the association believed older utility records needed to be verified before future improvements could begin. I thanked the crew for their professionalism and showed them my property survey. Within minutes, they packed their equipment and left without argument. They had no interest in creating conflict once they realized the ownership information they had received was incomplete. After they drove away, I spread both maps across the hood of my truck. One showed modern development plans. The other displayed decades-old topographic surveys that I had collected long before the neighborhood existed. The blue utility markings lined up almost perfectly with the natural drainage channels my father had taught me to recognize when I was a child. That coincidence was too precise to ignore. I returned to the spring house just before sunset and listened to the steady sound of clear water flowing beneath weathered stone. The mountain was quietly revealing the same story it always had. Someone below was no longer searching for the best place to build a scenic trail. They were following the path of the water itself, and I had the uneasy feeling that Margaret believed whatever she found at the end of that path already belonged to the Homeowners Association. The following Monday, I took a personal day from work and drove straight to the county records office instead of returning to my engineering projects. If the association was following the path of the underground water system, I wanted to know exactly what history they had overlooked. Old public buildings have a smell that never seems to change. Dust, aging paper, polished wood, and decades of quiet conversations filled the archive room as I signed the visitor log and requested every document connected to the mountain, the surrounding watershed, and the original development of Willow Ridge Estates. The clerk disappeared into a storage area before returning with several oversized map tubes, bound survey books, and a stack of engineering reports that looked as though nobody had opened them in years. I spread the first survey across a large wooden table. The faded contour lines matched the map my father had shown me countless times when I was growing up. Every ridgeline, every drainage channel, and every natural spring appeared exactly where nature had placed them long before any subdivision existed. The next document caught my attention immediately. It was an engineering study prepared nearly 30 years before the first house was ever built. The report explained how the future neighborhood could receive a reliable water supply without disturbing the mountain spring itself. A system of collection lines had been designed to work with the existing watershed, not against it. I continued turning pages. Easement agreements, environmental reviews, hydrology studies, soil analyses. Each document added another piece to the same puzzle. None of them suggested that ownership of the spring or the surrounding land had ever been transferred away from the mountain parcel. Then the clerk returned carrying one final storage box that had been located in an off-site archive. Inside were handwritten property records dating back several generations. Nestled between yellowed deeds and tax assessments was a carefully folded water rights agreement recorded decades before modern zoning regulations even existed. My pulse quickened as I read every line twice. The agreement recognized the spring as part of the mountain property while granting downstream access for utility infrastructure through specific legal arrangements that depended on the continued ownership of the source. It was not complicated, but it was incredibly important. The neighborhood had the legal ability to receive water under established agreements, yet the origin of that water had never belonged to the homeowners association. They had confused operational access with ownership. Those were two completely different legal concepts. I requested certified copies of every relevant record before leaving the courthouse with a folder far thicker than the one I had carried inside that morning. During the drive back to the mountain, I stopped several times to compare the historical surveys with modern satellite imagery stored on my tablet. Every natural drainage path aligned perfectly. Every collection point matched the engineering studies. Even the old stone spring house appeared on maps that had been drawn before most current residents of Willow Ridge Estates had been born. By the time I reached the mountain road, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley below. Looking toward the neighborhood, I finally understood why the contractors had been tracing those blue utility lines. They believed they were confirming infrastructure beneath association control. The county records had quietly revealed something entirely different. They had been standing within reach of a resource the neighborhood depended on without realizing the legal foundation beneath it had never changed. I did not call a lawyer the next morning, and I certainly did not drive back to the neighborhood demanding apologies. That would have accomplished nothing. Years of working on public infrastructure had taught me that the strongest arguments were never made with raised voices. They were made with accurate records, qualified experts, and patience. Instead, I organized every certified document into chronological order across my dining room table. The oldest handwritten deed rested beside modern engineering surveys. Historical watershed maps lined up perfectly with current aerial photographs. Environmental reports confirmed the location of the natural spring, while decades of county filings documented the same property boundaries without contradiction. The pattern was impossible to ignore once every page was viewed together. The spring had always been part of the mountain parcel. The water distribution system serving Willow Ridge Estates had been legally constructed to receive water downstream through recorded agreements, but ownership of the source itself had never changed hands. Those were two separate legal realities that someone had apparently confused over the years. Before taking another step, I contacted the county survey office and requested a formal boundary verification. A licensed survey crew scheduled a field inspection for the following week. I also submitted copies of the historical records to the Regional Water Resources Office with a simple request for clarification regarding maintenance responsibilities and recorded water rights. I did not accuse anyone of misconduct. I simply asked the agencies to confirm what their own archives already contained. Several days later, I noticed unfamiliar county vehicles parked near the entrance to Willow Ridge Estates. Survey crews carefully examined old monument markers that had been buried beneath leaves and soil for years. Engineers compared modern digital equipment against iron pins driven into the ground decades earlier. Every measurement they recorded pointed toward the same conclusion I had already reached in the archives. Meanwhile, the regional water specialist requested access to inspect the spring house and the collection channel on my property. I welcomed them without hesitation. They photographed every feature, reviewed the historical construction records, and compared the natural flow with the original engineering documents. One inspector quietly smiled while studying an aging stone marker that matched a reference shown on a survey prepared nearly 30 years before. He remarked that it was rare to find historical infrastructure preserved so carefully. I simply thanked him and continued answering questions. Throughout the entire process, I remained deliberately quiet. I never contacted Margaret. I never attended a homeowners association meeting. I never posted anything online. Rumors, however, traveled much faster than official reports. Neighbors began noticing government vehicles visiting the mountain. Contractors who had previously marked utility routes suddenly stopped appearing. Conversations grew noticeably quieter whenever new survey crews arrived. Then, one cool morning, I received copies of the preliminary findings. Every major historical record had been confirmed. The property boundaries matched the original deeds. The spring remained part of the privately owned mountain parcel. The downstream utility agreements remained valid, but only within the exact legal framework recorded decades earlier. Standing beside the old stone spring house as cool water continued flowing steadily beneath weathered granite, I realized something important. Nature had never created the confusion. The mountain had never changed its course. Only people had built assumptions on top of records they had never taken the time to read, and those assumptions were about to collide with the facts. The official inspection reports were not even finalized before the atmosphere inside Willow Ridge Estates began to change. Utility trucks that had once arrived with quiet confidence now parked beside the road, while crews compared engineering drawings with fresh survey data. Temporary markers appeared around the neighborhood pump station, and county inspectors walked slowly between equipment cabinets, taking photographs and making careful notes without offering opinions. I stayed on the mountain and continued my normal routine. Every morning, I checked the old stone spring house, recorded the natural flow rate, and documented weather conditions just as I always had. The spring never changed. It continued producing the same steady stream of clear water that had followed gravity through the mountain for generations. The only difference was that everyone had finally started paying attention to where that water actually began. 3 days later, I received a phone call from the Regional Water Resources Office requesting my attendance at a coordination meeting with county officials, engineering staff, and representatives from the Homeowners Association. When I arrived, Margaret was already seated across the conference table with several board members and the association attorney. The confidence I had seen during our first meeting was gone. Stacks of survey maps, certified deeds, engineering reports, and historical easement records covered nearly every available surface. A county surveyor began by projecting the original boundary survey onto a large screen. One by one, he overlaid modern satellite imagery, digital property records, and the newly completed field measurements. Every layer aligned with remarkable precision. The spring house, the watershed, and the surrounding ridgeline all remained inside the mountain parcel exactly as they had been recorded decades earlier. Next, a water resources engineer explained the distinction that had caused so much confusion. The neighborhood possessed lawful access to water delivery through recorded infrastructure agreements, but those agreements had never transferred ownership of the natural source itself. They governed distribution, maintenance responsibilities, and downstream use, not the spring or the land surrounding it. No dramatic accusations followed. Nobody raised a voice. Instead, the room became unusually quiet as each official document confirmed the same conclusion from a different perspective. Margaret finally turned toward me and asked why I had never simply told her all of this from the beginning. I looked at the certified records spread across the table before answering. I told her that I had tried to explain several times, but explanations are easy to dismiss when someone believes they already know the answer. Official records, however, speak with a voice that does not change depending on who is listening. The county officials then outlined several corrective steps. Future planning documents would need to reflect the verified property boundaries. Proposed recreational improvements crossing private land would require proper authorization before any additional work could even be considered. Existing water service would continue without interruption because the established legal agreements remained fully recognized. As the meeting ended, I gathered my copies of the surveys and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. Looking back toward the mountain, I realized the real victory had never been about proving someone wrong. It was about allowing the facts, patiently preserved for decades inside forgotten maps and weathered records, to restore the truth that the landscape itself had been quietly protecting all along. Within a week, the changes became visible to everyone living in Willow Ridge Estates. New notices appeared on the community bulletin board announcing that several proposed improvement projects had been suspended pending revisions to official planning documents. The colorful trail maps that had once shown walking paths crossing my mountain quietly disappeared from the association website. Survey stakes that had stood along my property line for months were carefully removed by the same crews that had placed them there. Nobody argued. Nobody protested. The facts had already done all the talking that was necessary. I continued spending my weekends on the mountain exactly as I always had. Each morning began with the same familiar walk through towering pines until I reached the old stone spring house. Cool water flowed steadily beneath the weathered stones with the same gentle sound that had greeted me since childhood. I still carried my field notebook, recording flow conditions and weather observations, not because anyone required it, but because the habit reminded me that careful records often outlast opinions. One Saturday afternoon, I noticed several residents hiking toward the overlook. Instead of crossing onto my property without asking, they stopped respectfully near the boundary marker I had restored months earlier. One older couple introduced themselves and admitted they had genuinely believed the homeowners association owned everything above the neighborhood. They apologized for wandering across the property in the past and thanked me for helping preserve the natural spring instead of allowing unnecessary construction around it. We spent nearly half an hour talking about the history of the mountain, the watershed, and how the original engineers had worked with the landscape rather than trying to reshape it. Their curiosity felt sincere, and for the first time I realized most homeowners had never intended to disrespect private property. They had simply trusted information that turned out to be incomplete. A few days later, the Homeowners Association held another public meeting. This time the atmosphere felt entirely different. County survey maps were displayed alongside revised planning documents, allowing residents to see the verified property boundaries for themselves. The engineering reports explained why the natural spring remained protected and how the existing water agreements would continue serving the neighborhood exactly as intended. Questions came from homeowners, rather than arguments. People wanted to understand how the system actually worked instead of assuming they already knew. Margaret stood before the room and acknowledged that the association would update every future development proposal to reflect the confirmed records. She also announced that educational information about the neighborhood water system and surrounding private lands would be shared with every new homeowner moving forward. It was not a dramatic speech, but it represented something far more valuable than public embarrassment. It showed that accurate information could replace misunderstanding. As I drove back up the mountain that evening, the setting sun painted long shadows across the valley below. The neighborhood fountain was flowing again. Children were riding bicycles along quiet streets, and sprinklers watered freshly cut lawns just as they always had. Looking across the landscape, I smiled at the irony that had been quietly waiting there from the very beginning. The mountain had never needed to defend itself. The spring had never changed its course. The old maps, the stone spring house, the forgotten boundary markers, and every faded county record had patiently preserved the truth until people were finally willing to read the story the land had been telling all along. Several months have passed since that morning when silent fountains and dry sprinklers sent an entire neighborhood searching for answers. Life on the mountain has settled back into the quiet rhythm that first convinced me to buy it. Every sunrise still paints the granite ridges with warm light before drifting across the valley below. The scent of pine, damp earth, and fresh mountain air still greets me every time I unlock the gate and walk toward the old stone spring house. The water continues its steady journey through the same collection channel that has existed for generations, completely unaware of the arguments people once built around it. The county eventually completed every remaining administrative update. Revised property records were distributed alongside corrected planning maps, ensuring future development proposals reflected the verified boundaries from the very beginning. The Homeowners Association adopted new review procedures requiring independent verification before any project involving neighboring properties could move forward. It was not a dramatic change, but it was an important one. Assumptions would no longer replace official records. One afternoon, Margaret asked if she could meet me on the overlook. This time she arrived alone, carrying nothing except a folder and 2 cups of coffee. We stood beside the spring house, overlooking Willow Ridge Estates while the breeze carried the sound of flowing water through the trees. She admitted that when the neighborhood was first developed, the association had relied on summaries and planning documents instead of tracing every historical record back to its original source. As leadership changed over the years, those assumptions gradually became accepted as fact. Nobody intentionally rewrote history. They simply stopped verifying it. She handed me a revised community information booklet that clearly identified surrounding private property, explained the protected watershed, and encouraged residents to respect both recorded boundaries and the natural environment that supplied their water. I thanked her because correcting a mistake requires far more character than pretending one never existed. Since then, I have occasionally seen families hiking along the approved public trails below the mountain. Some wave when they notice me working near the fence line. Others stop to ask questions about the spring, the old surveys, or the engineering history behind the neighborhood water system. I always answer because understanding creates better neighbors than assumptions ever could. Looking back, people often ask whether buying the mountain was worth all the trouble. My answer has never changed. I did not purchase it to win an argument. I bought it because I recognized its value long before anyone else bothered to look closely. The greatest lesson from everything that happened was never about legal documents, engineering reports, or county surveys, although each of those mattered. It was about patience. Facts do not become stronger because someone speaks louder, and truth does not disappear because it is temporarily ignored. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, preserved inside weathered maps, forgotten boundary markers, and a spring that has never changed its course. As I stand beside the same flowing water today, I often remember something my father told me while teaching me to read the land as a boy. He said that every landscape remembers its own story even when people forget it. He was right. The mountain never forgot. The water never forgot. In the end, all I really did was give the truth enough time to find its way downhill, just as it always had.